Hi, it's Jen from Shabby Fabrics with a fun tutorial today of showing you how to make this beautiful Gather Together wall hanging. This is actually a collection from Benartex, and when we saw it, we thought how fun to just be able to break up the panel, make some fun patchwork blocks, and display that to really let family and friends know that we love you. We give thanks for all the blessing that God has bestowed on us, and it's one of my favorite times of the year for that very reason. So sometimes when we get a panel, what we've discovered, and it's just maybe through the process of fabric production, but sometimes panels don't always come out square. If you've been quilting for any amount of time and worked with panels, you probably already know this. And so that was definitely the case here with this panel, where sometimes, and maybe they're even just designed that way, in this instance, our panel is just a little bit wider than it is tall. And for that reason, we decided to add what's called a coping strip, actually to the top and the bottom, and you can see that right here, where there's a little bit of the black added in, but we didn't add it left and right because it didn't need it. And so that was how we were able to make our panel basically become square, because the patchwork block right next to that is absolutely square and needs to be married up since it's its immediate neighbor, right, with a little bit of sashing in between. So for this specific project, we felt the easiest way to approach that was actually with a 10.5-inch square up tool by Creative Grid. Your panel does have 6 panels in it, as well as some trim. That might even be fun to add that trim maybe to the back of your quilt if you wanted to do that, or maybe save that, maybe use that for some extra decor items you have in mind for the Thanksgiving holiday. So as always, you want to press out your fabric. We highly recommend you do not wash this fabric or steam it excessively. We don't want this panel shrinking up or getting distorted, which will absolutely add a complication that you don't need. So starting off with any one of these panels, and they'll all really be trimmed the same way. I'll just grab this one because it's closest to me. Is the first thing I need to do really is kind of get this extracted out of my larger group. And if you're wanting to just get it out of here just initially, there's no harm in giving it a nice wide berth just out here, right, well away, so that we know we can kind of just work with that fabric and get the larger bulk of this kind of just out of our way. You never want to do this without first understanding what the project is. And because I know that we'll soon be using a ruler here, I know that if I give this nice wide berth out here, I'm going to be just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of that aside for now. And let's look at our individual panel here. With our 10.5-inch ruler, my goal now is to put my ruler exactly over top of my block so that I have the same amount of background showing on the left and the right. And now that I see that's somewhat equal, I'm going to try to keep that consistent. And it's about 1/8 of an inch that I'm seeing on the right and on the left. Now I'm trying to move my ruler so that I'm seeing the same amount of background top to bottom. Notice I'm seeing more background here, so I'm going to push that up. The goal being to have this as centered as possible before we make this cut. So this is how we knew that this was wider than it was tall. If it was a square, we would be seeing the same amount of just a little bit of that background at the top, and you can see we're seeing way more of the background at the top and bottom, proving that this printed panel is wider than it is tall, which is again why we'll later be adding the coping strips to the top and the bottom to try to get the block to be the same size globally. All right. So as I'm working to really try to measure this so that I'm getting this I'm using my lines on my 10.5-inch as best as I can, but also keeping this the same distance left and right. just a little bit of extra effort to make sure we're where we need to be. And when we feel confident that we're at that place, now we'll go ahead and give a cut. You can imagine after you've worked that, specifically, you do not want to lift up your fabric at this point. This is why a spinning mat is worth its weight in gold. Really all the time when you're trying to cut around a project, but specifically when you don't want to lift the fabric again. You really want to leave that in place. Now, let's turn that back so that we have our block facing us. That's our first step in our process, but then there's a second step, right? Because you could see that if we added a 1/4 inch or a 1.5 inch wide strip here, we're still going to see a little bit of that, and that's going to be a problem. So we need to make another cut, but only to the top and the bottom. Yes, there's a little bit of the background showing here, but that's not going to be a problem. Why? Because when we sew our strips on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, all of that will be taken up in our seam allowance, but that is not the case from the top and the bottom without making one more cut. So we can use either the same ruler that we just used, which is fine, and what we'll be doing now is measuring over 3/8 of an inch, remembering that, and I'm going to actually grab a different ruler here, a little bit easier to use, remembering that each one of those tick lines is 1/8 of an inch, so you're counting 3 of those. So we know that that's our normal 1/4, right? So we go to one more of those lines right there. And we're going to give a cut right there at 3/8. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side of that block. Lining up that 1/4 and scooting it over to that next tick line is, for me, the best way to assure that I'm at the right location. And I can also count 1, 2, 3 tick marks, so I know that I'm at 3/8 of an inch. Once this process is done, your pattern will guide you into cutting some 1.5 inch by 12.5 inch strips, and they're only sewn to the top and the bottom of the block because remember, we're not trying to add a width to the lateral left and right, just the top and the bottom. We need to add some girth so that our block is going to end up square. So we're going to place those in our corners, left to right, pin here, pin on the opposite corner, and it never hurts to pin just so that panel doesn't start to sneak back when we're sewing. And we'll do the same thing on the opposite side, right? Now, I'll keep pinning. I have on my machine, because I want to sew a good 1/4 inch seam allowance, I have my seam guide right here. Now, there's not really a need to sew with what's called a scant 1/4. A regular 1/4 inch is sufficient. So I'm just going to be using the seam guide here. And I know where that is on my machine. I've measured it many times, and that's going to assist me in sewing a good 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'll keep pinning. Let's get our irons heating up to full hot and go sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you like sewing with, whatever brand of thread that is, we found the gray or black was a great choice in this. I would not recommend sewing this necessarily with a white. Now I've got that in here so you can see what I'm doing and you'll ultimately see my stitching. But if I was sewing this upstairs, would be either a gray or a black. But again, I'm having a white so you can see what I'm doing, especially later on as we move toward our flying geese block. All right, let me head over here and we'll sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, and we're going to press toward the panel. All right, that 10.5 inch You know, that's one of those rulers that I call mission specific. So many times when, especially as an early quilter, I was doing good to have one ruler. I really did. I had a 6x24. It was not Creative Grid. Creative Grid really didn't exist at that time. And I found squaring up to be just about impossible without other rulers. And I didn't realize, you know, that would have been a wise investment. I should have bought less fabric and more rulers at that point. I think I would have had a lot more success with my quilt blocks. But this is now going to come in play again because we're now going to lay this on here and we get a chance to square this up. Now, this is where we want to have the same amount of black showing top to bottom, right? So if we wanted to find that exact center, we absolutely can find that location. Why am I pointing that out? Because this ruler has a bullseye. Notice the white line right there. That's the bullseye. That is the spot. So if you ever want to find the exact center of a block, you can finger press. There it is. I'm going to put that right there. And as I look, I'm just confirming before we start making any cuts. Notice my white line is running very parallel to that. My black lines are running parallel to the bottom here. Now we turn, and we're going to trim. And we're going to trim. Now your panel block is prepped and ready to go. And of course, you're going to repeat that process for your other 5 panel blocks. Go ahead and put those aside for now, knowing with absolute certainty that those are set up and ready to go to marry up now with your 10.5-inch Flying Geese unit that starts off with a really fun center. I was so drawn to this collection. I love the words. I just love all the things about fall. Fonts are very popular. I love that this fabric really is going in all directions. So no matter how I turn it, it's super cute. But if you want to, if there's a certain expression you want to have that's upright, then just turn that one upright. So that, of course, is your center. But let's talk about the Flying Geese units. And this is where, again, Creative Grid absolutely shines. So we're going to start off with a black piece of fabric and actually 4 yellow fabrics. And we're going to start off with them actually in opposite corners. This is a really cool technique for making 4 Flying Geese units with incredible precision. They're actually oversized, and we get the ability to trim those up, and I'm going to be showing you that today with the Ultimate Flying Geese tool from Creative Grid. So once these are placed in opposite corners, our favorite technique is to simply use our Creative Grid tool. Now, the instructions that, of course, come with your tool tell you to corner to corner, draw a line, and sew a 1/4 inch on either side of the line. 100% works. Absolutely works. I like a technique where I can pre-draw those lines, and I frankly can just sew on that line. I don't have to seek where that 1/4 inch is located, right? So I can just draw and I can draw, which is what we've done here. Notice also that in addition to drawing and sewing on the lines, one of the things that we also did, and we did this actually before we sewed, is where those things overlap, we trimmed. Like, let me just show you that again. I definitely want to show, I want to give you the confidence to trim that. The reason we trim is there is some bulk created where those overlap. We know that anytime there's extra fabric involved with a patchwork block that doesn't need to be there, it should be trimmed away because it can create bulk that is actually disruptive to getting points to come out exactly the way that we want. So again, let's just pretend that we've drawn the lines, or let's just go ahead and draw the lines. Let me just redo that real quick. Just draw that line. The fastest way to remove that bulk is to just, with your scissors, and making sure that we're not cutting our background. Just, I'm angling toward that other side. Remove the fabric, and there you go. So that just reduces the bulk. We've already sewn this one just to save us a little bit of time. Notice that's in black. That is the color thread we used to put the project together. Removing our pins, we're going to cut corner to corner. And I'll take that out of the way. By the way, this is our beautiful background. If you are going to be picking up this kit, that is the absolute perfect background. Again, those celebratory expressions. I love that. Thanksgiving, faith, welcome friends, gather together, give thanks, all those awesome expressions. And again, pressing away the second set. Now, with an extra, I'll just show you this here, we put another yellow square in the saddle, again with our seam guide, and we have a shorter seam guide that we could use, or of course the longer seam guide. Draw, draw, sew. Once again, we're cutting that. With the fourth square, you would do the same thing here. This is how, with 1 black and 4 gold fabrics, you end up with 4 oversized Flying Geese units that you get to square up. Press to the outside and press to the outside. Now those Flying Geese units are oversized. So this is a great thing because it gives you an opportunity to square them up. Now our instructions specifically talk about the Ultimate Flying Geese, and we reference something called the letter E. And you're like, where did that come from? Well, on the Ultimate Flying Geese tool, we have finished sizes of Flying Geese units. And this tool makes a multitude of sizes, everything ranging from a 1/2 inch by 1 all the way up to 4 by 8. And for our project today, our finished Flying Geese units are going to measure 2.5 by 5. So that is why inside our pattern, we would say the unfinished unit needs to measure 3 by 5.5 because of the 1/4 inch seam allowance. But remember, always remember that the Ultimate Flying Geese tool, and really all of Creative Grid's tools, are always based on finished sizes, not the unfinished size. That's why today our letter E is what we'll be using. And it just happens to be that that first measurement of 6 3/4 was the size that our black fabric was, and our 4 gold fabrics were cut to 3 3/4. 1 large black and 4 of the gold equal 4 oversized Flying Geese. And now this is where the second function of the tool comes into play. Remembering that we're letter E, we have a trim function, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. Each of those to be working on whatever size Flying Geese unit you're working on, and for us, it's E. So we're simply going to drop this beautiful black solid line right down on top of our Flying Geese unit, which is exposing the right side in the top. And notice I'm on the trim 1 function. So we have trim 2 functions. The first job is to trim the right and the top, and then we're going to rotate the mat around to the opposite side to do the secondary trim. So we'll go ahead and trim to the top. Again, you can see that the spinning mat plays a really important role here. Something else I want to show you from the overhead camera here is notice how the dashed line is at the absolute point there. That is when you're sewing this into the block. this is where the needle should pass. That's a true 1/4 inch. So that's another confirmation you're at the right place. Now let's continue the rotation one more time clockwise. And we're going to drop down, trim 2, looking for our letter E, right? We know that's us. So we're just going to scoop that over until it's bracketing our triangle. And notice that we have this line up, this line up. I'm going to make it just a little turn, and that this diagonal line is shooting right up that seam. We're in the absolute perfect location to make this trim and then the final trim. You can see, need a little bit of room to turn the mat, but the work that this mat does is incredible. And you can see the Ultimate Flying Geese tool is a perfect marriage with that spinning mat. And now you have an absolute perfect Flying Geese unit. And you get to trim up the other 3, which of course is what's making up our block here. That is really what's making up the block. So you fussy cut your center. You don't even need to fussy cut it. Whatever you cut is going to be beautiful, right? It's going to be whatever you want. But if you want a special expression, just be mindful. I really like that expression, autumn leaves are falling, right? We make our 4 flying geese. We have these in the corner, and then you're on to assembly here. And I'm just going to show you the back of that. So you can see this is how we press that. Really no mystery. You can see the top row is going together, pressing away to the black, because that's where all of our seams are. And the center pressing toward the middle, bottom row pressing out again. And then we've got, that gives us the interlocking seams, 1/4 inch seam, same here, 1/4 inch seams, and then we press. Now let's look at our project here. There's also some sashing, a little bit of cornerstone that really kind of brings the project all together. When I was initially designing this one, I kind of just had one block after the next, and it just seemed to be almost a collision. And I really thought that this gorgeous kind of deep teal was just really kind of set this whole thing off. So you have just a little bit of patchwork here to do with your sashing, your cornerstone, that all going together with your inner border, your outer border, and of course your binding there, and then that gorgeous backing. So you can see really this is, even if you're presented with a panel that may not be perfectly square, don't worry. And if you're maybe working on a project at home with a panel maybe you've bought years ago that maybe you want to just adapt into this design, kind of take that same concept of, okay, what size coping strips do I need to add to the top and bottom, or maybe the left and right, to square this thing up? So sometimes I've been discouraged when a pattern or a panel wasn't square and I thought, oh, I can't use it. Yes, I can, by adding those coping strips and getting it to square so that I can now add a patchwork block as its neighbor, and it looks like a beautiful, like it was planned all along, right? So thanks for giving me part of your day to show you how the blocks go together for this panel quilt, and be sure to subscribe. That is how you know about our newest videos, promotions, and so much more. I'll see you soon.